Welcome to Public Legal Information. Scarborough is a home for many vulnerable low-income individuals, including immigrants, refugees, racialized groups, and many more. Scarborough is underserved with limited resources, so we need to learn about Scarborough to address this inequality and poverty. Therefore, we would like to share a webinar presented by John Stapleton on Scarborough's profile. Thank you, John, for bringing this important information to our communities and decision makers for change.
Okay, so this is Scarborough Poverty Profile highlights for Power and Community, and that I've done for Reggie's group, Power and Community, but also for your orientation here. The people who pay me are the Metcalf Foundation, so I always like to put up their names, and my own little policy shop is called Open Policy, and there's the date. Now, I want to make some acknowledgements here. I work closely in the Neighborhood Change Research Partnership at the University of Toronto with David Hulchansky, who you might have seen some of his work on what's called 3 Cities. He's quite well known in the city of Toronto, but what's not well known is that his mapper extraordinaire is a fellow by the name of Richard Moranin, and Richard lives in Malvern, which is something I did not know until earlier this year, and he's lived there all his life, and he's now living and taking care of his mother in Malvern, and he is probably, I'm biased, but I would say he's the best social mapper in Canada, and you'll see that in many of the maps I have here. Harvey Lowe, who is either in the process of retiring or he's already retired at the City of Toronto in their division that works on the data. And also social policy in the internal, not the operational part of the City of Toronto, but in their policy shop. And then finally, I have a research associate by the name of Yvonne Yuan, who works with me, and she, since I'm not only bad at Excel, but I can't do it at all. So I need to hire somebody to do my Excel work. And she's also a mapper, and she lives in Bendale, which is one of the wards of Scarborough, and she graduated from UTSC, so all Scarborough all the time, so that's good. So I'm going to start you with a joke, or let's just say that it was a Universal Press Syndicate copyright in 1998 for U.S. News and World Report. And this is a cartoon, and it was called The Vast White Ring Conspiracy. So I'm just going to take you through that and see what you think. So it's from 22 years ago, but just think of it as we go through it. And one of the things that Marshall McLuhan, who was a great Torontonian, and who had explosive and very new theories about how media works, and he was the one responsible for saying the media is a message. He said that behind every joke, there is a deep cultural grievance, and you can't have a joke without a grievance. And so that's kind of a interesting thing. And I especially, every time you see humor that's done about homeless people, humor that's done about poverty, humor that's done about people who are not doing well, and that sort of thing, you can see the grievance that's part of that. So here is the actual joke, and it says, the first pane says, whites live in cities, the crowning glory of civilization. And the second panel says, minorities then moved into cities, hello, goodbye. Then the third, the whites flee cities to suburbs and say to themselves, this is better. So Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, think about the 40s and 50s. Minorities move into the first ring suburbs. So then the minorities start moving from the downtown into the suburbs, and the whites move into the second ring suburbs. So now we're talking about the Mississaugas, we're thinking about the Caledons, Halton, Durham. Cities are dead, this is better still. Then the whites moved back into the city and said, it worked. now we're back into the city. And so you see this pattern that occurred. Now, does that resonate with you in terms of how Toronto works? Just a nod, or anybody think Toronto worked like this over its history? What do you think, Nixa?
Yes, indeed. Downtown is so expensive, and I know I'm not trying to live there, but you know, the wealthy, they can live there.
And it's the Forest Hills, the Rosedales, and all that sort of thing, and even up through what we call the Annex. That's where you see the white people in Leslieville have moved back into there. Well, I'm going to surprise you and say this cartoon was not written about Toronto. It was written about San Diego, and so an American city. So there is a commonality that happens among many, many cities. And so for many people who have seen this over the years, they'll think, oh, well, that was obviously written about Toronto. Well, it was written by Tom Tolles, and he is from the United States. So that kind of gives you a bit of a sense of the history and somehow the racial movement of the city. So let's look at Scarborough in context in over 50 years. So first of all, you need to know that Scarborough is 23% of the city population. Etobicoke is 13%. Central Toronto is almost 30%, 28%. East York is small at 5%. North York is 24%, so a little bit bigger than Scarborough at 23%. And within the Scarborough, Northern Scarborough is about 10%. So above the 401 to Steeles, from Victoria Park to the Pickering Town line is about 10% of that 23%, and Southern Scarborough is about 13%. And finally, we just have the small region of York, which is embedded in the west side of the city. So we make up 23% of the city's population. Of the 23, 10% is above the 401, 13% below, and what else can we say? Oh yes, we have 30% of the land mass of the city of Toronto. So we're more spread out. We got 23% of the population, but we got 30% of the land mass. So go back to 1970 and look at Scarborough here. What we were was completely middle income. We had just a tiny little bit of higher income just in the northern part of Scarborough near Victoria Park, and everything else in 1970, 50 years ago, was middle income. No low income at all, just a little tiny bit. What you're seeing is the east of Victoria Park, around Crescent Town, that little bit of brown down there, but 1970. And let's fast forward 50 years and see what it's like. Now look at it, where we see deep poverty, deep inequality, and you see it in that huge area here that's in the northern part of Scarborough, and then you see inequality in southern part of Scarborough. But that low and very low income goes right from the lake all the way up to Steeles and past Steeles. So it's the largest single mass of low-income census tracts in the census metropolitan area of Toronto, and you can see that the only part that even rivals that is is in North York and Rexdale, the Jane Finch type areas, and in the southern part of not Etobicoke, but the southern part of North York, and then northwest Rexdale on into Brampton, where we see the low-income communities. But the highest concentration of poverty is not in northwest Toronto. It's actually in Scarborough, where you see the highest concentration of very low income on the south part of Markham into Scarborough, and then down through mostly into the mid part of Scarborough is where we have the most the lowest average individual income. Okay, so that's quite a change. So is everybody familiar with something called the NIAs, Neighborhood Improvement Areas? Okay, the city has for years, along with the United Way of Greater Toronto, has designated certain areas of the city to get special support. And all of the 31 neighborhood improvement areas are within the 48 lowest income neighborhoods. So you can see where those neighborhoods are. They generally come down in the west end along the railway, and in the northwest end you can see they are in North Rexdale, North Etobicoke, and in the Jane Finch area in the northwest part of North York. So then you also see within Scarborough that we have a number of the lowest 48 neighborhoods by average income after tax, after shelter costs. So this is once you paid your rent. Here's the lowest 48 neighborhoods by average income from the last census. Now, too bad that the last census was 5 years ago, but we got a new one coming up, and we'll see what that is. And then the gray area, of course, is the highest 92 neighborhoods by income. So why do I have 48? Because all of the NIAs, the neighborhood improvement areas, the places that are designated for special supports and services, are in the 48 lowest income neighborhoods. So when I go to the next slide, what you're going to see is that there are many neighborhoods that do not have NIA status, but they are in the lowest 48 neighborhoods by average income. And so one of the things that you will notice is that far northwest Etobicoke is in those poor neighborhoods, but doesn't have an NIA status. But when you get to Scarborough, you'll see that a very large part of northern Scarborough is in the poorest 48 neighborhoods, but they have no neighborhood improvement status. Now that's something that some folks, I've written on this, saying that this is very, very unfair. The whole idea that Malvern lost its neighborhood improvement area status in the last go round, I think is quite a problem. And you can see that various areas of northern Scarborough, right contiguous, going from the 401 to Steeles Avenue, are in the poorest neighborhoods, but they don't have neighborhood improvement status. What you will see is a lot of the NIAs are in southern Scarborough, and that means that they get extra money and extra help from the city and special status in terms of being at the front of the line for a lot of different supports and services. But so there's a sense in which, and I'll certainly betray this bias, that I will tell you that the downtown bias is very much not really looking at Scarborough. And I'll also say that there is a neighborhood bias in the media when we've been talking about COVID, when we've been talking about racialized poverty, when we've been talking about housing and that sort of thing. Jane Finch, North Etobicoke, North York gets all the attention, and very little attention gets paid to Scarborough. So I'm hoping that you'll all have fire in your bellies, and you'll be thinking about how to advocate for Scarborough, because it's quite clear that in many ways that the city has not kept up with our situation and has not kept up with the funding. There's so many different ways in which Scarborough has been.
A quick interruption. Reggie, you are not recording it, right? It is not showing.
No, it says actually recording.
Okay.
And if I want to,
I think it's recording. I can see it. I can see a little red dot, which usually means recording.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So anybody got any bit of comments, or do I just motor on? Hearing none, okay, I'll go ahead. Now, what I want to...
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
Sorry. I wanted to know about the neighborhood improvement status.
Yeah.
About how do you go about losing it? Especially if you said that they haven't done a census for 5 years. Like, how do you even get on this neighborhood improvement?
That's a good question, because what the city and the United Way adopted was something called the Urban Heart tool. And the Urban Heart tool is a multifaceted tool for deciding what areas of the city need extra help, and it's used all over the world. But that tool is supposed to be used in 2020 again to reallocate and redesignate the neighborhood improvement areas. I have not seen anything so far this year. I think this has been sort of a casualty of COVID in terms of the planning process, because I haven't seen anything go ahead on that. But I have a large report right now into the city that was sponsored for a special motion by Jennifer McKelvey, who's one of our 6 councillors, and Cynthia Lai, who is another councillor in Scarborough. And so it means that one of the things that they must do when they relook at the neighborhood improvement areas and the redesignation, that they must take this report into account. Now, the reason that Northern Scarborough ends up with no neighborhood improvement areas is because it has very little subsidized housing, okay? It has 1/3 the amount of subsidized housing that the rest of the city has, and it has roughly 1/3 the subsidized housing that Southern Scarborough has, okay? And that's just because Northern Scarborough was late to the party as being built up, and most of the subsidized housing was built in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and very little subsidized housing has been put in place since then. So as a result, they were using before shelter costs, and they didn't use what they should have been using, which was after shelter costs. So a number of places like Malvern and like other parts of Northern Scarborough actually lost their NIA status because of, in my view, improper use of the Urban Heart tool. So, and especially in Malvern, because it's the 8th poorest. It's the 8th poorest community by average income in Toronto, and yet it doesn't qualify for the NIA status, because they were looking at things like hospitalizations, they were looking at such things as walkability, they were looking at various different aspects of health and transportation, things like that, and they just missed out. But it really is kind of terrible that you can be the 8th poorest. Where I live is up towards Steeles in the middle there, in a place called Milliken, and Milliken is the 12th poorest neighborhood in the city, and it also did not qualify for NIA status, and you see that a lot of other places do. Now, why would places that have subsidized housing, why would they look poorer? Well, they look poorer because people are in them, especially if they are on social assistance, if they're on ODSP, if they're on OW, they get very, very low allowances because their rents are very, very, very low and very artificially low. And because of that, they look poorer, but they aren't actually poor. They're probably better off than the people who are in the non-subsidized housing, who are paying 60 and 70% of their incomes on rent. People in subsidized housing, and especially those on OW and ODSP, pay somewhere between 16 and 25% of their income on rent because the rents are low. But they look very poor. If you look at them on paper, they look poorer than the people, because the people who get maximum OW or maximum ODSP are the people living in the private sector, and the people who are getting much lower ODSP and OW are in subsidized housing. And so it artificially designates the areas that you see in the purpley pink to be the NIAs, which I think is a real mistake on their part. Because you look if you look at Rexdale, if you look at Jane Finch, and you see the amount of subsidized housing that's around there, and especially in subsidized in southern Scarborough, you see far less. For example, in my own neighborhood of Milliken, you see one dot. We have one building in the whole neighborhood. If you look at southern Asian Court and North Asian Court in the middle there is, in those areas, there is no subsidized housing buildings in those areas. So that's what happens. You can see in the top one, well, very little subsidized housing, and that's what really gets you the NIA status.
Right. Thank you, John, for explaining about how you get the NIA status or not, and why we have lost it. But just my last and the second part of my question is, according to your statement, you wanted us to make a note. So I just wanted to know how, as community engagement animators, are we supposed to be influencing changing our NIA status? Are we supposed to be pressuring these counselors that you mentioned, or what exactly?
I would quite happy to give you a copy of the report that I did called Double or Nothing, which says if you get subsidized housing, you get an NIA, and if you don't have subsidized housing, you don't get an NIA. So I'm quite happy to make those available to you, and hope that you can continue to make yourself knowledgeable about them, and then also advocate for them. So turning over to
how can we affect the NIA? That's what I want to know. How can
you keep on watch the city, watch when it comes up for renewal, write letters, talk to your city councillor, support the idea of NIAs for North Scarborough, and also to just to ensure that those issues are before them. I think there's various different ways you can.
So we should encourage the public to do that in our legal education. We're supposed to encourage the public to write letters to the counselors.
Sure, if they understand it, and if you can get people to get behind those things, I think that's great. So let me move on here and show you that in terms of working poor, you can see that overall working poverty is going up. You can see that in the Toronto Census Metropolitan Area, it's at 7% as of 2016. And you can also see that the highest percentage of working poverty is in, guess, Scarborough at 9.7%. So once again, North York is just behind, the Jane Finches are just behind, but like I said earlier, it seems that all the press, whether it's COVID related or poverty related or housing related, seems to gravitate towards North Rexdale and North York, even though that we have. So if we start speaking up for Scarborough, we say, look, we have some of the most problem situations in Scarborough, and we should be paid attention to in that regard. What I also wanted to show you, this is brand new data that nobody's seen before. I just stuck it in. This is data I didn't use for a previous report, talking about people, the percent living in mutual dependency in the Toronto CMA and former municipalities. And you can see that in the, once again, Scarborough at 33.7% has the highest concentration of people. That's where people are living with families, where you have embedded caregivers, where you have 3 generations in the household. You have uncles, aunts, nieces, grandma, grandpa, that sort of thing. That highest concentration of mutual dependence living in housing is in Scarborough. As within the city of Toronto itself. And then when we look at it overall in the whole of the Toronto CMA, which includes Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, and all places like that, you can see that Brampton has the highest level of people living in mutual dependence. And it's also one of the areas, not surprisingly, that has the highest concentration of COVID-19 cases, because if people are living close together, they're living in families, multi-generational, then you're going to see mutual dependence is going to lead to higher exposure. And you can see that in this graph here. And then you can see that in terms of working age population, the percent living in mutual dependence, look at white, 22% are people that aren't living in, and we all know that when you think of white families, and I know from the old white guys that I hang out with, they're you know, they're mostly in the mom and pop situation. You know, there might be kids in the home, but generally speaking, you don't have the grandparents and the uncles, aunts, and nieces and things like that. And then as soon as you get into other races, the non-Caucasian population, you can see that goes up. You can see that the Black community is about 50% higher than the white community. And then finally, the Filipino population is the one that lives in the highest level of mutual dependency. A lot of these things are cultural. They have to do with how people have always lived, how the various different cultures and folkways that they bring here, and what the community expectations are for that. But you can see that once again, the white community is the one that lives in the least level of mutual dependence. So Scarborough is very high, but it certainly isn't the highest when we look outside of Toronto. So when we think about our visible minority population, you can see that when we look, and let me try, I'm gonna push you over a bit so I can look at you can see that where you have the South Asian, Chinese, Black, and Filipino, which are the top populations, you can see that Northern Scarborough from Victoria Park over to about Morningside or so has a very, very high population of Chinese in the visible minority groups. You can see that once you go to the east of Morningside, you see much more South Asian and Black. And then you can see the same thing below, in Scarborough, below the 401, you're seeing an awful lot of South Asian community and Black community, and to a certain extent Filipino too. But certainly the concentration of Chinese is highest in the northwest part, and the highest concentration and then of South Asian throughout, and also the Black community throughout. So you can see exactly where those things are going on. And these things are also broken down by community. And if you want to get stats by your own community, you can get that off the city. And I can make sure that you find out how to do that. So also important when we look at, this is Toronto overall, the top 15 languages, also with the rate of no knowledge by mother tongue, you can see that those who are speaking Cantonese is the top language outside of English. Mandarin is the second most, and then all of the other languages are below that. But you can see that there's also a very high rate of knowledge with rate of no knowledge by mother tongue language. So then when we look at country of birth, one of the things, whenever I ask a group of people, or if I'm doing a presentation, I'll ask them, I say, where do you think recent immigrants, where do you think most of them come from? I can tell you, everybody says China and India. But that's old news, right? Because in the last census, what we find is that the top by far is Philippines, and certainly, and whoops, they do like that. Take us back here. Gee, this really pushed ahead, eh? It's really sensitive. I'm working on a Surface. And the Surface computer is really sensitive. So you can see there that the Filipino community and China and India and Iran are the four top ones in the most recent census, but previously it had been China and India. So things are changing in the community. In the case of the Filipinos, I can tell you they have the lowest level of working poverty. and even though they have the highest rate of mutual dependence. And I think the reason they have the highest or a low rate of working poverty and a low rates of poverty have to do with three things. Number one is the fact that the people who come here are going into job categories that are very that are exploding, like personal support work, for example, is the highest increasing job in the city of Toronto. And it's just, once again, it's different cultures and different ethnicities tend towards certain types of jobs. And the second reason is because there's a great deal of move towards home ownership amongst the Filipino community. And the third is the fact that the Philippines is wait for this, is the only country in Southeast Asia, the only country in Southeast Asia that has a social security agreement with Canada, which means that their folks can, once they turn 65, they can get old age security after 1 year. And they're the only country in Southeast Asia that can do that because they have an agreement with Canada. The only African country is Morocco. So a lot of our top immigration countries have no social security agreement with Canada. And so that can mean it's much easier for Filipino people to take care of the elderly because they have access to our old age system much before other communities do. So that's another thing. We can talk about that deeper in print. Now, when we get to persons with no knowledge of English or French, you can see that it's largely where, look at the deepest amount, which is 10 to 46%. You can see that that is in where we see the greatest concentration of that in Scarborough is in North Scarborough, in the area which is largely Chinese. So once again, people speaking Cantonese and Mandarin are people who have the highest, and maybe that has to do with the languages itself, maybe the culture, maybe the fact that there's certain the fact that just how hard it is to learn English, and the fact that we had a lot of family class immigration in the earlier part, which means that you have older people coming into Canada. And I can certainly tell you this, the older you get, the harder it is to learn the language. And the younger you are, if you've ever seen a 2-year-old kid picking up a language, you know that you know how easy it is for them and how hard it is for the rest of us as we start to age. So that's again how Scarborough looks in terms of its no knowledge of the English or French, largely a Northern Scarborough phenomenon. So transit. So persons commuting to work an hour or more in the city of Toronto in 2016, just take a look at Scarborough, okay? So we see that it's the northwest end of the city, but in the case of Scarborough, it's all throughout Scarborough where we see the highest levels, and especially northeast Scarborough and southeast Scarborough, the highest concentration of people have to spend a lot commuting. So that means getting into work and then getting back for work. And so a lot of the bias in terms of how policy gets done in the city of Toronto is thinking in terms of Scarborough being a community that commutes into downtown and then commutes back to Scarborough. And so there's some truth in that, but a lot of the working poor, people who, at least until COVID-19 came along, are people who would be cleaning offices, who would be serving people their meals, serving, working in all sorts of service type entry jobs would be coming from Scarborough into the downtown and then going back again. And so when you think of the quality of life, if you're on transit all day, and the cost of transit and then the availability of transit is much, much more is much more concentrated in terms of that deficit in transit in Scarborough, and as you can also see in the northwest part of the city. But the northwest part of the city, and you're hearing a theme from me, has started to do a lot better because they got a subway route that, if you look at that subway, goes above the 401, and then it goes to Shepherd, and then it goes to Finch, and then it goes to Steeles, and then it goes above the 407. And where's the Scarborough subway? Even the biggest plans for a Scarborough subway would not take it across the 401. So there is a huge inequity in terms of how the city plan gets done in terms of Scarborough. Scarborough is very much left behind, and it's quite clear. I mean, all the data shows that, and it's important to keep in mind. When we look at jobs, interesting enough, and this is important because when we look at the 2006 to 2016, that's between two censuses, we know that the whole of the city of Toronto had 7.5% more jobs, and most of the city had more jobs. But let's look at the two places that had fewer jobs. One was Etobicoke, and that has a lot to do with is it all in North Etobicoke, I can tell you that. And in Scarborough, it's generally been the center of Scarborough from Steeles down to the lake is where we see that job loss. So what does that do? I mean, especially where one of the real unfairnesses comes in is in our employment insurance program. Our program that we love to call EI, which is about to get some changes next week in the throne speech, but EI has something called a variable entrance requirement. In other words, the amount of weeks you need to get EI and then how long you're going to get EI. Toronto is the toughest place in Canada to get EI. But even though Scarborough's unemployment rate before COVID was 9.6%, which would put us into certain parts of rural New Brunswick, but rural New Brunswick gets EI on far fewer weeks than it would be in Scarborough, and the EI lasts a lot longer. So there's huge cross-Canada asymmetries and unfairnesses and inequities and inequalities that we've seen. And nothing could be clearer here than when we see the actual loss of jobs. So even though we grew, the amount of jobs that we've got was even less. So that's an important thing for you to know, and it's an important thing to understand how EI works. So let me just go back here. What you can see where the job loss is, you can see that the light brown and the brown shows you where the job loss took place. And you can see with the deep blues where the job changes to the positive took place. And you can see the downtown and the central corridor is the real winner with either a little bit of change or with positive change. And we see how Scarborough and North York have been the ones that have lost and again, stigma all has a lot to do with this. If you're a business, where are you going to locate your business? You're going to try to locate it in an area of the city you think that is doing well, doing better, and all that sort of thing. And you can see here how, especially in the mid part of North Scarborough, is where a lot of the job losses took place, as well as, interestingly enough, along the LRT corridor. You can see, and the subway corridor was where you see some of that job loss taking place. So that's a whole other conversation in its own. So let's move on to housing. Here is the subsidized housing percentage of all housing City of Toronto. You can see that subsidized housing in the city. You can see that if you take North Scarborough, a point I was making to you before, you see that a lot of North Scarborough has neighborhoods with and census tracts with less than 2% of subsidized housing. Then you move into Southern Scarborough and you see that there's some areas that have 30 to 62% of all the housing in place would be subsidized housing. And so you can see the same thing in the northwest part of the city, where you see most of the subsidized housing is in place. And in total, we have about 80,000 subsidized tenants in Toronto. There's 125,000 subsidized units in the in all of the Toronto Census metropolitan area, you know, the surrounding parts. So most of that is in the city of Toronto, and an awful lot of it is in downtown, is in the northwest part of the city, and in Scarborough. So it's important that you know where that is. And you can see how a lot of the NIAs, which are in red, the red boundaries there, the NIAs and subsidized housing sort of go hand in hand. So here's, again, looking at average income after tax, after shelter cost per capita in 2015. You can see the high income area is sort of that city one in the middle along the corridor of Yonge Street going up into up to the 401. That's where the rich people live. You can also see that it's true if we go out to the west part of the city, you can see the High Park area along Bloor. In that area, the High Park area is the rich part of the city. You can start to also see Leslieville. And in Scarborough, the rich part of the Scarborough is along the lake, below Kingston Road, Gilwood, and places like that. So, but once you get north of Kingston Road, that's where you see most of the poverty within the city. So, rooming houses, boy, this machine is sensitive. You can see rooming houses are illegal in Scarborough and Markham. This is a huge issue for Power and Community. It's a huge issue for West Scarborough and Scarborough legal clinics, because a lot of the people, when you have housing that's deemed to be illegal, you have tenants who are very powerless. And we have where most of the rooming houses are in the, you can see is the housing pilot that was going to take place but didn't. It's going to gear up again this fall. Is in the areas from the 404 over to, right along, where are we looking? Yeah, east of McGowan. So a lot of the rooming houses are in that area. So in the main part of the city, rooming houses are legal, but in Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke, rooming houses are illegal. And so when they're illegal, it means that you're going to have more of them. That's what I said. You're going to have more of them when they're illegal. If they're legal, you're going to have fewer of them. Why? Because the operator is getting cash. They're getting the cash under the table. They're not paying income tax on it. They're able to exploit their tenants. And the more illegal they are, the more to the operator, the more desirable it is, because they get to run the show, so to speak. So Scarborough, looking at food bank use and the long-term trends. First of all, I wanted to show you this, that we see going back to 1970, when we were a sort of middle-income community. We can see that middle income, the very low and very low income has skyrocketed over that 50-year period. That's the red line. The middle income share has gone way down, but we haven't got too many more rich people in Scarborough. So that profile is very different from the rest of the city, where you'll see in the middle of the city or in the High Park area, you see a lot more high and very high income people. You see lots of middle income people, and you see fewer low income people. So the city is really a divided city in that way. So if we look at daily, this is a map that's done by Daily Bread, but it also brings in some other data from Food Share and North York Harvest. You can see that of the whole city, you can see that it's Scarborough that has the highest increase in food bank usage. So increase of 20% in food bank visits. Now this is all pre-COVID, but you can see that that's where you see the decreases in the south part closer to the lake, and you see the increases once again in the north part of Scarborough. And interestingly enough, where you see 18, which is also red, that is a food bank that delivers all its food to Scarborough. it's always interesting to see. They had a food bank visit. They actually have a depot there, but it actually goes to Scarborough. So Scarborough has been at the vanguard of the food bank increases that have taken place. So my last topic is voter turnout, the last civic election, 2018, and this, I hope this will get you going, and that is the highest and lowest voter turnout rate locations, Toronto's 2018 election. You see the high turnout tends to be in the areas that are more the richer areas. And you can see that the lower turnout is in the areas that, and we see it in the downtown, but we also see a lot of that in Scarborough too, where we have some of the lowest turnouts. And we didn't have very much of the high turnout in Scarborough. So when you have language difficulties, where you're facing poverty, where it's hard to register if you're in a rooming house, you know, all of these things can lead to lower voter turnout. So it's a disenfranchisement of the people. So you can see here on this one, the voter turnout rate, dark blue, is the good turnout. But then you can see, let's look at Northern Scarborough again, and other parts of Scarborough. You can see where we had voter turnout between 11 and 29%. I mean, that's really low. That's bad. These are people who can vote and who choose not to because they feel disenfranchised. And once again, you see more of it in Northeast Scarborough, you know, where you're seeing you're also seeing language issues of various sorts. You're seeing engagement, and you're also seeing more people who can't vote because they haven't got their PR yet, refugee claimants, etc., people who are not in a position to vote. So even though this map itself was of eligible voters, but that's even going to be more. So here's city wards by commuting time and voter turnout rates of the 2018 election. And you can see that that the people who have to commute a long way, people who have to commute a long way are also people who where the voter turnout is. You're going to see it. You're not going to see it quite as high. So the commuting duration for the employed labor force age 15 and over in private households with the usual place of work or no fixed workplace area. So it shows you that where we have very low commuting times, we tend to have a higher voter turnout. And look at Scarborough Rouge Park, Scarborough Gilwood, Scarborough North. The three areas that have the highest commuting duration also have some of the lower voter turnouts.